The moment Callum picks up his passport, looks at the second boarding pass sitting on the counter, and leaves it there. That's the move. Not the fight, not the ultimatum, just the passport. Welcome to his eternal diary.
The suitcase had been packed for 11 days. I know that because Isolde had packed it the morning after we got engaged, laughing about it, saying she couldn't help herself, that she'd been dreaming of Lisbon since she was 16. I'd watched her fold the white linen dress she bought specifically for the trip. She'd held it up against herself in the mirror and said, "This is a honeymoon dress. This is what I'm wearing when we land." I thought about that dress on the morning she told me she wasn't coming. It was 6:12 in the morning. I was standing in the kitchen in the dark, drinking coffee I hadn't waited long enough for, still hot enough to sting. The cab was coming at 8. Our flight was at 10:40. 12 days in Lisbon, and then a week down the coast in a place called Comporta, which I'd researched and booked and paid for in full 18 months before the wedding. Isolde came into the kitchen already dressed, but not in the white linen dress. She was in jeans. She had her keys in her hand. I said, "You're up early?" She said, "I need to talk to you." And I already knew. Not the specifics, but I knew the shape of what was coming the way you know rain before you can see the clouds, something in the pressure of the air, something in how she wasn't looking at the suitcase. She said Garrett's show had been moved to tonight. She said she'd tried to reach me about it, but she hadn't, not once, not a text, not a voicemail, nothing. And I knew that because I checked my phone 3 times while she was talking. She said she'd already told him she'd be there, that she'd promised months ago before she knew the dates had shifted, that it was the last night of his European tour, and he was going to dedicate something to her from the stage. I put down my coffee. I said, "He's going to dedicate a song to my wife, at a concert she's attending instead of our honeymoon." She said it wasn't like that. I didn't ask what it was like. I just looked at my coffee and then at the window where the street was still dark and thought about the 11 days that suitcase had been standing by the door. Garrett Voss. I need you to understand who Garrett was, because the story doesn't work without that understanding. He wasn't famous in the way that requires explanation. He was famous in the way that requires context. 5 years ago, he'd been in a band that had one song go supernova on streaming platforms. A mid-tempo thing with a guitar line that was simple enough to stick in your head for a week, whether you wanted it there or not. The band dissolved 2 years after that. Garrett went solo. He made 2 albums that were critically well-received in the specific way that means nobody bought them. He toured small venues. He had 43,000 followers on Instagram, and the devoted, almost cultish attention of people who felt they'd discovered something the mainstream hadn't caught up to yet. Isolde was one of those people. She'd loved him before she loved me. I knew that going in. She'd gone to his shows, had a photo with him from 3 years before we started dating, kept it in a frame in her study. She called it a fan thing. But I accepted it as a fan thing because what else was I supposed to call it? She was smart and warm and funny and made me feel, in the first year we were together, like someone had turned on a light in every room I walked into. But there had always been Garrett, a text here, a like there, a late-night story on Instagram where she'd tagged a song of his without commentary, just the audio, and a black screen. I'd noticed all of it. I'd filed it. I hadn't moved on it because I was still telling myself the story I wanted to tell. Standing in that kitchen at 6:12, I understood I had been filing evidence for a relationship I'd already decided to stay in, regardless of what I found. That's the thing about self-deception. It's very organized. She was still talking when I walked to the counter and picked up both boarding passes. As I looked at them side by side. Callum Vane, seat 14A. Isolde Vane, seat 14B. She said, "Callum, say something." I said, "Have a good time tonight." She looked at me. "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I hope the show is good." She was waiting for the argument. I could see it. The slight lean forward, the prepared defense, the speech she'd rehearsed on the drive from wherever she'd been. Garrett's, probably. Or at least on the phone with him. She was ready for my anger. She had prepared for my anger the way you prepare for weather, with the right gear and a plan to wait it out. I didn't give it to her. I put her boarding pass back on the counter. I took mine with me when I walked back to the bedroom to shower. Let me tell you what I knew at that moment before I tell you what I decided. That's because those are two separate things, and they matter in sequence. I knew that Isolde had been in contact with Garrett in a way that went beyond what I'd been told. I'd seen her phone once, not deliberately. She'd left it face up on the bathroom counter, and a message had come through while I was brushing my teeth. One of those previews that shows the first line. And the first line was him calling her by a name I'd never heard her called. A pet name. Something short and private. She'd grabbed the phone before I could process it, laughed it off as old stuff, and I'd let it go, because I was standing in my own bathroom in the apartment I paid for, and I couldn't quite make the world tilt to the angle that would make what I'd seen make sense. Now, it made sense. I knew that she'd chosen to be at his show over being on our honeymoon. Not the night before the wedding, not in the heat of some emotional crisis. After the vows and the reception and the photographs, and the first night in the hotel where she'd been present and attentive and had genuinely seemed, to be starting something new. She'd waited until the boarding passes were printed to make this choice. What I decided, standing under the shower at 6:20 in the morning, was this. I was going. Not to salvage anything, not to clear my head, not even out of spite, which would have made sense, and which I'd have been forgiven for. I was going because Lisbon had nothing to do with Isolde anymore. Lisbon was mine. The booking was mine. The research was mine. And the 18 months of planning and the property in Comporta that I'd found by accident on a Tuesday night when I should have been finishing a report. The place where the light comes off the estuary and turns everything a particular shade of gold that only happens at 4 in the afternoon from November through February. That was mine. She was surrendering her share of it. I wasn't obligated to surrender mine. The cab came at 8. I loaded my own suitcase. Isolde was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and there was something in her posture that said she was still waiting for the argument, still waiting for me to come back to the room and make her defend herself. I stopped in the doorway. I said, "I'll call you when I land." She said, "Callum," I said, "have the white dress dry cleaned if you're not going to use it, as it's been in the suitcase for 2 weeks. I took the door handle on the way out. It clicked shut behind me with the sound of something calibrated. Not a slam, not a dramatic exit, just a door functioning as designed. In the cab, I looked out the window at the city waking up. I thought, I am 34 years old. I have been planning someone else's happiness for 3 years. I am going to Lisbon by myself, and I am going to think about that. The flight was fine. I slept most of it. There's something about flying alone that I'd forgotten. I'd become so accustomed to the small negotiations of shared travel. The armrest, the window shade, the meal, the movie, that I'd stopped noticing how much of my attention was being spent managing someone else's comfort. Yet on the plane to Lisbon, I put on something I'd been meaning to watch for 8 months, fell asleep 20 minutes in, and woke up over the ocean feeling more rested than I had in recent memory. I texted Isolde from the plane. I said, "Landed safely." We hadn't landed yet. I wanted to see how long it took her to respond. It took 4 hours and 11 minutes. By then I was in a taxi from the airport, and the message said, "Glad you're safe. Garrett's show was incredible. You would have loved it. I read that twice. Then I put my phone face down on the seat and watched Lisbon come toward me through the windshield." The apartment I'd booked was in Alfama, which is the oldest neighborhood in the city and which sits on a hill above the river, like it's been watching everything happen for 1,000 years. As the building was old in the way that means the walls are thick and the ceilings are high and the light comes through at an angle that makes even afternoon feel like early morning, I'd paid extra for a unit that faced the water. From the small iron balcony I could see the Tagus, the bridge, and on clear days, the statue on the far shore with its arms open toward whatever was coming. I put my suitcase down. I stood on the balcony. The air smelled like salt and something floral and the faint diesel of the river traffic. I had 12 days. I had no one to account to. I had a booking at a restaurant for 2. I'd call and change it to 1. I had a day trip to Sintra that could be done alone just as well as together. I had the Comporta week at the end, the property with the estuary light. I also had a decision I hadn't finished making yet. But I knew this the way you know a sentence isn't done before you've found the full stop. Going to Lisbon had been the right call. But going to Lisbon, and then what? That was the unfinished part. I ordered food and ate it on the balcony and drank a glass of wine and watched the sun go down over the river. I thought about Isolde standing in that kitchen in jeans instead of the white dress. I thought about the text, the 4-hour gap. The specific cheerfulness of Garrett's show was incredible. You would have loved it. You would have loved it. Written to a man she'd left on the night of their scheduled honeymoon departure. Written as if the sentence didn't mean anything. That sentence was the clearest thing she'd ever said to me. Let me back up. Because there's a version of this story where the betrayal starts on that morning, and I've been telling you an incomplete version. The full version starts 3 years earlier, and it starts with a habit. Isolde had a habit of leaving things unresolved. Not everything. Professionally, she was clean and precise. She was a contracts attorney at a firm called Aldercroft Partners, and she was good at her work. Known for it, the kind of good that doesn't require anyone else to say so. But personally, she operated in a way I came to understand, slowly, was a refusal to close doors. She didn't break up with people she was done with. She reduced contact gradually until it was the other person's responsibility to name what had happened. She didn't end friendships, and she let them thin out over months, until they were technically still intact, but functionally absent. It was efficient in a specific, plausibly deniable way. I'd noticed this pattern. I'd also noticed I was inside it, that by the time I was proposing, she hadn't so much chosen me as declined to leave, that there was a difference between being selected and being retained. I'd told myself that was cynicism. I'd told myself the weight of the ring in my pocket and the way she'd looked at me when I put it on her finger was the real thing, and the patterns I'd noticed were just the residue of past relationships she'd been working through. Garrett, though. Garrett was never going to reduce to residue. I understood that now. He wasn't a ghost. He was the thing she was staying haunted by on purpose, on the second day in Lisbon. I went for a long walk. I walked from Alfama down to the waterfront and then along the river for 2 hours. I stopped at a place selling pastéis de nata and ate 2 of them standing up. I bought a coffee from a counter so old the wood had gone smooth and dark with years. I did not check my phone. At some point, walking along the water, I had a thought that arrived so quietly it almost didn't register as a thought at all. It arrived as a physical sensation first, a kind of releasing in my chest, the loosening of something that had been compressed for a long time without my noticing. And then it became a sentence. I don't have to go back. Not I won't. Not I'm angry. Not I'm leaving. I don't have to. I stood on the waterfront and held that sentence and looked at the bridge and let it mean what it meant. I want to be precise about what I'm describing, because it wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no clarity descending from the sky, no music, no wave of emotion either terrible or transcendent. It was a quiet, practical reckoning, the kind that comes when you've been carrying a weight so long you've forgotten you're carrying it, and then you set it down for a moment and your body goes, oh. So that's what that was. I was carrying a marriage I'd accepted the terms of, but never negotiated. Isolde's terms were these. She was always going to be partially elsewhere, not necessarily with Garrett, though clearly with Garrett in some real and ongoing way. But even without him, she was always going to be a person whose most important emotional investments were managed at a careful remove from the people standing next to her. She was going to love in a way that allowed for exits. She was going to keep doors open. And I was going to be the one who named each unresolved thing, asked each clarifying question, and then accepted the answer that wasn't really an answer. That was the marriage I'd agreed to. Standing on the Lisbon waterfront eating a custard tart, I decided I didn't want it. Not in anger. In the way you decline something at a dinner party with a polite shake of your head. Simple, final, and entirely without drama. Now came the question of how. That question is what kept me on the balcony until 2 a.m. on the third night, looking at the river with a legal pad I'd bought at a papelaria down the hill. I wrote in longhand. I always think more clearly in longhand. Something about the physical commitment of it was the fact that each line costs something. I wrote, what do I actually have? The apartment in London was mine. I'd bought it 18 months before we started dating, and while we'd lived in it together for 2 years of our relationship and the 8 months leading up to the wedding, it was titled solely in my name, and I had been, whether consciously or not, deliberate about that. Isolde had suggested more than once that we look into joint ownership. I'd agreed we'd look into it. We'd never looked into it. I recognized now that I'd been running a quiet protection protocol without naming it to myself. Some part of me had known. The savings were largely mine. Isolde earned well, but she spent accordingly. She had a pension through Aldercroft, a moderate ISA, and a share portfolio her father had set up for her that was worth roughly £40,000. I had substantially more than that in a combination of accounts, a self-managed SIPP, and an investment property in Manchester that I rented out through a management agency. None of that was joint. We had one joint account, opened 6 months before the wedding, intended for household expenses. There was $11,000 in it, not nothing. I noted all of this on the legal pad without editorial, just facts in columns. On the right side of the page, I wrote, what does she have that I gave her access to? The answer was, not much. The joint account. A supplementary credit card on my travel account, which I'd given her for the honeymoon and which had a £5,000 limit. She'd used it twice in the past week. I noted the amounts without specifics. They were small, routine, the kind of spending that happens when someone is in a city rather than on a planned trip. I looked at the joint account balance for a long time. Then I called Tobias. Tobias was my oldest friend and also happened to be a financial advisor at a firm in Bristol. He answered on the third ring, which meant he was awake despite the hour, which meant he'd been waiting for me to call. He said, "You're in Lisbon." I said, "I'm in Lisbon alone." A pause. Then, "Tell me." I told him. Not everything. but the architecture of it. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons I'd always trusted him. He didn't rush to fill silence. When I was done, he said, "What are you thinking about doing?" I said, "I'm thinking about not going back." He said, "Oh, to the marriage or to the apartment?" And I said, "Both, eventually." Another pause. Then he said, "The joint account is accessible to both of you right now." I said, "I know." He said, "If you're certain about the direction of travel, you should move your half before she does." This is the specific point I want to explain carefully, because it matters. What Tobias was describing, and what I was already considering, wasn't theft. It wasn't aggression. It was the elementary protection of assets I'd contributed to equally. Joint accounts, in English law, are accessible in full by either party. There is no automatic split at the point of divorce initiation. If one party empties the account before proceedings begin, the other party can seek an accounting from the court, but that takes time, cost, and energy. The simpler move was to make the question moot. The following morning, I transferred 50% of the joint account balance, £5,530, to my personal account. I left the other half untouched. I was not taking her money. I was removing mine. I also, on Tobias's advice, made a note of the date, the balance at the time of transfer, and the equal nature of the split. Documentation. In the event of dispute, the record would show a 50-50 division, which is the standard in dissolution of jointly held marital assets anyway. Then I called my solicitor. Elena was her name. I'd used her for the apartment purchase and the Manchester property, and she'd done both without fuss and with the kind of thoroughness that made me trust her beyond those transactions. Oh, she was at her desk. She always seemed to be at her desk. And her tone changed slightly when I explained the situation, shifting from professional to careful in the way good solicitors do when they understand they are about to be necessary. She said, "When did the wedding take place?" I told her. 3 weeks ago. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Callum, in England and Wales, an annulment on grounds of non-consummation or lack of consent is possible within the first 12 months. But what you're describing sounds more like the grounds for standard divorce, which changed with the 2022 legislation. No-fault divorce. You can apply unilaterally after 20 weeks from the application date." I said, "I know the framework. So what I want to know is the first step." She said the first step was to not make any financial moves that could be characterized as dissipation of marital assets. I told her about the joint account. She said, "That was clean, equal split, documented, reasonable. What about any other joint holdings?" There weren't any. The credit card would be canceled as soon as I was back. The apartment was mine. The other accounts were mine. There was nothing else to untangle. She said, "Callum, the one thing I'd caution is acting too quickly on everything while you're abroad. Come back, take 2 weeks. Think clearly." I said, "I am thinking clearly. That's why I'm calling from Lisbon." She knew me well enough to hear what I meant. She said she'd start preparing the documentation. She said to call her when I had a return date. As I told her I'd be in touch, I sat with the legal pad and wrote the word housing and drew a line underneath it and thought about the apartment. I loved that apartment. It was on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse in Bermondsey, and the windows faced east, and in summer the mornings were something I'd never taken for granted. I'd lived there for 3 years before Isolde moved in, and I'd been happy there, in the quiet, undemonstrative way of someone who'd found a place that fits. I did not want to give it up. But I also understood, sitting on a balcony in Alfama with the river below, that the apartment would become a contested space the moment the conversation happened, even if it was legally mine, even if she had no claim. It would become the place where we'd had the argument, where her things still were, where every object had a context I'd have to decide whether to keep or throw out. There was another option. I'd been offered, 6 months earlier, a secondment opportunity at Thornfield Architecture, the firm where I worked as a senior associate, to their Lisbon office. The firm had established a partnership with a Portuguese practice 2 years before, and they were looking for someone who could anchor that partnership for 18 months, do the relationship management, the project oversight, the face-to-face work that can't be done over calls. I'd declined because Isolde didn't want to move. I hadn't gone back to that offer. But Thornfield had filled the role temporarily with someone who was due to rotate back to London in 4 months. I had a very direct conversation with myself about whether I was making a decision or reacting to an event. The distinction matters. A decision is made from a considered understanding of what you want. A reaction is a mirror image of whatever hurt you, shaped entirely by the other person's action, dependent on it for its meaning. I'd spent 2 days in Lisbon eating good food and walking by rivers and sleeping without the specific alertness I apparently maintained at all times in my own bed, and I'd started to understand what I actually wanted. I wanted to live in a city that smelled like salt and warm stone. I wanted to work on projects that meant something architecturally, and the Lisbon office handled heritage restoration work that Thornfield London rarely touched. And I wanted a morning that didn't come with the compressed air recycling smell of an argument that hadn't been resolved. This wasn't a reaction to Isolde. This was something I'd wanted before her and suppressed because of her, and now had the clarity to name. I emailed my director at Thornfield. His name was Nigel, and he was the kind of man who respected directness so much that he'd once told me the best thing I'd ever done was send him a short email. I sent him a short email. I said I'd been reconsidering the Lisbon secondment. I said I understood someone was covering it, but I wanted to know if there was a path back to that conversation. I sent it at 7 in the morning London time. He responded within 40 minutes. He said, "I'll be honest, your timing is better than you know. Call me." I called him. What he said, the person currently covering the Lisbon anchor role had asked to return to London early. Personal reasons? He didn't elaborate. He said if I was serious, and if the timing worked, and if there were no complicating factors on my end, he could have a conversation with the Lisbon partner by end of week. I said there were some personal matters I was managing, but that my position in London was uncomplicated. He said, "Good. I'll make the call today. Sit tight." I wrote secondment on the legal pad and put a tick next to it that I knew wasn't premature. On the 5th day, I went to Comporta. I'd kept the booking. It felt important to keep it, the way you keep an appointment with yourself even when everything around it has changed. The place was 3 hours from Lisbon by car, and I rented a car specifically to drive it, a small, not new Fiat that smelled of dust and dried pine, which was exactly right. The property was a converted farmhouse on the edge of a tidal estuary. The owners had restored it in the way that Portuguese people restore old things, which is to say they hadn't over-restored it. The walls were white and thick, the floors were terracotta, the shutters were green, and one of them didn't close fully, which meant in the morning the light came through the gap at an angle that fell across the bed and woke me at 6 without an alarm. I woke at 6 on the first morning and lay in the stripe of early light and thought, I'm going to live here. Not this specific property, but this specific quality of light, this specific stillness. This was available to me. It had been available to me for years, and I'd had someone in my life who'd made me feel, not through any specific argument, but through the weight of her preference, that my wanting it was negotiable. The estuary at 4 in the afternoon was exactly what the photos had suggested, the light going amber and specific across the water. I sat at a table outside and wrote on the legal pad for 2 hours. What I was actually writing, though I didn't title it at the time, was a plan. Here is what I understood about disappearing from a life you've built with someone else, the practical mechanism of it. You don't vanish. You restructure. You don't burn down. You redirect. The apartment was mine and would remain mine. Tobias recommended I speak to a letting agent as soon as I returned, put it on the long-term rental market at a rate that would cover the mortgage and generate monthly income while I was abroad. This was straightforward, as the Manchester property was already income-generating. Between the two, I'd have enough coming in monthly to cover a comfortable rental in Lisbon while the secondment salary ran. My SIPP and personal investments required no action. They were already in my name, already protected by their structure, already growing in a way that was independent of my address. The supplementary credit card on my travel account. I called the bank from Comporta and had it cancelled. The bank confirmed 2 recent charges, both small, both food-related, both in London. I noted this. Neither was a red flag. I cancelled the card on grounds of loss. Simpler. The joint account I'd already handled. What remained was telling her. I'd been in contact with Isolde the way you maintain a fire at low temperature. A text every day or two, short, informational. She'd reciprocated in kind, which told me something. She wasn't worried. She was waiting for me to come back and for things to normalize, for the hurt to soften into something she could manage at a comfortable remove. She was expecting the Isolde and Callum pattern to hold. Incident, cool down, gradual return to function, nothing formally resolved, forward motion resumed. That pattern required my participation. I was declining to participate. On the 7th day, sitting in a restaurant in Comporta with a glass of local wine and a view of the estuary going orange in the evening, I called her. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call. I said, "How are you?" She said, "Missing you. When are you home?" I noticed the phrasing. Not when are you back or when do you land. When are you home? It's like she'd decided the geography of my belonging. I said, "I want to talk about something." She said, "Okay." I said, "I'm going to stay." A pause. "In Lisbon? For how long?" I said, "I don't know yet." Another pause, longer. Then, "Callum, what does that mean?" I said, "It means I've been offered a work opportunity here that I turned down before, and I'm going to take it. It means I need time and distance to think about where we are. It means I'm not coming back next week." She said, "You can't just..." and then stopped herself. I waited. She said, "This is because of the concert." I said, "No, it's not only that." She said, "Then what?" I said, "I think you know what. I think you've known for a long time, and you've made choices that made sense for you, and now I'm making a choice that makes sense for me. I'm not angry, but I want you to hear that. But I'm not coming back next week." She was quiet. Then, "Are you ending our marriage?" I said, "I'm giving myself space to be honest about it, which I haven't been." She said, "Callum." I said, "I'll be in touch. Give my regards to Garrett." I ended the call. I sat for a while with the phone on the table, and the wine going warm and the estuary turning the last colors of the evening. I felt the way the air feels after a storm that hasn't been dramatic enough to mention, but that has nonetheless cleared something. She called back 4 times. I let it go to voicemail. In the morning, I would read the messages. I would respond to what required responding to. But for the rest of that evening, I sat with the estuary and did not look at my phone and let the thing that had just happened settle into its actual shape. But what I didn't expect was that it would settle into something so much smaller than the space it had been taking up. The secondment came through on the 9th day. Nigel sent a formal offer via email while I was walking through a market in a town called Alcácer do Sal, 30 kilometers south, which I'd driven to on an impulse because the road was good, and I had nowhere specific to be. The offer was for 18 months, with an option for extension, with a relocation allowance and a furnished corporate flat in Lisbon's Príncipe Real neighborhood until I found something of my own. I read it twice, standing between a stall selling dried herbs and a stall selling blue and white tiles. I accepted by reply. I called Tobias. He said, "So you're doing it." I said, "I'm doing it." He said, "Okay. Why do we need to talk about the apartment?" I'd already spoken to a letting agent. Not in a frantic, burning things down way. I'd reached out to the same agent I'd used when I bought the Manchester property, a firm called Wyndham Residential, who knew the Bermondsey market, and who told me, when I called from a public bench overlooking the Tagus, that the apartment could be listed at a rate that would cover my mortgage and generate a monthly surplus of around £400 after management fees. I said, "List it." He said, "I'll need access." I said, "I'll arrange that when I'm back." What I meant was, I'll have a conversation first, and then I'll arrange that. Tobias, when I told him, said, "And Isolde? She's still in the apartment?" I said, "For now." He was quiet. I said, "I'm not displacing her immediately. I'm going to be fair about the timeline." He said, "Good. Just don't be so fair you give her enough time to complicate things." He was right. In the background of all of this, the legal clock was running. Elena had filed the initial documentation. Under the current law, the 20-week period before a final order could be sought would begin from the application date. The sooner the application went in, the sooner the count started. There was also, Elena had mentioned, the question of Isolde potentially seeking what's called a financial remedy order. A claim on assets she might argue had been built during the marriage, or that she'd contributed to, or that she had a reasonable expectation of benefit from. The marriage was new. The contributions were unequal. The apartment was premarital and solely titled. Thus the other assets were similarly clean, but the longer the process ran, the more opportunity there was for complication. I flew back to London on the last day of the planned trip. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to have the conversation in person. Not for sentimentality, because things said in person are real in a way that things said over the phone are not. And I wanted what I said to Isolde to be real, to land with the weight it deserved, to not allow the distance to soften it into something she could mentally file away as temporary. The flight was in the late afternoon. I watched the city get smaller below me and thought about the estuary at 4 o'clock, and how that light was going to be there tomorrow, whether I was watching it or not, and how soon I would be. Isolde was in the apartment when I arrived. She'd been there. So she'd made dinner. I could smell it. Something that meant she'd been thinking about this as a scene. A homecoming that she could manage with food and warmth and the familiar routines of couplehood. She was standing in the kitchen when I came through the door, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Something between calculation and genuine uncertainty. She said, "Hi." I said, "Hi." I put my bag down. I didn't take off my coat. She said, "Are you hungry?" I said, "Can we sit down?" We sat at the kitchen table where I'd drunk coffee 11 days ago at 6 in the morning. She sat across from me with her hands around a mug. I noticed she was wearing the white linen dress. I noted that and did not say anything about it. I said, "I've taken a job in Lisbon. It's an 18-month secondment with Thornfield. I'm going in 4 weeks." She said, "Without asking me?" I said, "It's not a conversation we can have the same way we would have before." She looked at me. "Because of one concert." I said, "You know it's not because of one concert. You've known for years what the actual issue is. We don't need to perform the argument." She was quiet. I said, "I've spoken to a solicitor. I'm starting the process." Her face changed. Not dramatically. It was a small change, something around the eyes, a tightening. She said, "Callum, we've been married for 3 weeks." I said, "I know." She said, "We can work through this." I said, "You mean I can decide not to notice what I've noticed? That's what working through it would mean." She started to say something about Garrett. She used the word complicated, which I'd been waiting for, and the word history, which I'd also been waiting for, and she said that she'd never done anything physical, said it with the emphasis of someone presenting it as a significant concession, as if the absence of one specific thing was the boundary of what mattered. I let her finish. I said, "I believe you. It doesn't change what it is." She said, "What is it?" I said, "He's the version of your life you kept open, and I was the version you settled into because it was available and functional, and you thought the other one would eventually quiet down." She didn't deny it. She opened her mouth and then closed it. I said, "That's not a marriage I'm able to be in." She said, "So that's it." I said, "That's it." She looked at the table. Then she said very quietly, "I do love you. You should know that." I said, "I know." And I believed it, in the small and insufficient way that something can be true and still not be enough. But loving me isn't the same as choosing me, and you know the difference. She didn't say anything. I said, "You can stay here for the next 4 weeks. I'll need access for the letting agent to do measurements and photos, probably in week 3. I'll give you enough notice." She looked up. "You're renting the apartment." I said, "I need it to cover the mortgage while I'm abroad." She said, "Where am I supposed to go?" I said, "You make good money. Aldercroft Partners pays well. You'll be fine." She said, "This is very cold." I said, "I know." I said it without apology because it wasn't cruel. It was practical, which is what cold sometimes actually means when a woman says it to a man who is finally being clear. I was not abandoning her to poverty. I was not taking anything she'd contributed. I was not denying her next steps. I was simply not stepping back from mine. I went to the bedroom. I slept in the second bedroom, which had been a study before she moved in, and which still had a desk I used, which meant sleeping in it felt less pointed than using the sofa. I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the terracotta floors in Comporta and the way the green shutter let in a line of light at 6 in the morning. Sleep came quickly. The 4 weeks were not pleasant, but they were managed. I moved through the apartment with the efficiency of someone packing up a version of themselves that no longer fit. Not dramatically. I didn't throw anything out in the night or remove her photographs from the walls. Nothing performative. Yet I packed what was mine into a shipping arrangement I'd organized for Lisbon, boxed things carefully, labeled them. The things that were genuinely shared, furniture we'd bought together, kitchen equipment, decorative items she'd chosen. I left. She'd come home and find them there with instructions about what I considered mine versus communal, and a contact at Wyndham Residential for the handover. Isolde, during those 4 weeks, was trying something. I could see it. She moved around me with a specific quality of nearness, a studied presence, appearing in doorways, laughing at things she didn't need to laugh at, making the apartment smell like food in the evenings. She was staging a life she thought I might want to stay in. I was sorry for her. Not contemptuous. Sorry, because she was genuinely doing the best version of herself. That's the most affectionate version, and it was too late. Not because I was punishing her, because I'd seen something clearly that I couldn't unsee. When you understand that someone has held you at a specific temperature, warm enough to keep you present, cool enough to keep themselves free, you can't unfeel it. The management of it, the calibration, and once you've felt that management, every subsequent warmth carries its trace. Garrett, during this period, was not invisible. He contacted her. I didn't see the messages, didn't look for them. But I knew from the way she held her phone sometimes, from the private quality that came over her face in the evenings when she thought I wasn't watching. He was there. He was always going to be there. 3 years ago, I might have asked about it, might have made it a discussion, a negotiation, an honest reckoning we could have together. Now I understood that some negotiations were already complete. You don't renegotiate the terms of a contract that's already being dissolved. You read the fine print, you protect your position, and you let the process work. In week 3, Elena told me the divorce application had been accepted, and the 20-week period had begun. In week 3, Wyndham Residential sent a photographer to the apartment, and I was there while they moved through each room, capturing the east-facing windows and the converted warehouse brick and the kitchen I'd had refitted 2 years ago. Isolde was at work. The photographer was professional and uninvested, which was exactly what the moment required. In week 3, and I also had a conversation with Tobias about the SIPP and the long-term investment positioning that I'll describe only in summary. I moved to consolidate assets under my own administration, reduced any joint-capable exposure, and had a very dull, very important series of phone calls that resulted in a cleaner balance sheet than I'd had at any point in the 3 years of the relationship. Tobias said, on our final call before my departure, "You've done this well." I said, "I've done it correctly." He said, "Sometimes those are the same thing." They are, sometimes. On the last evening in London, I ordered Indian food from the place on Bermondsey Street that I'd been ordering from for years, and I sat at the kitchen table and ate it, and looked around the apartment and felt, not what I'd expected to feel, which was grief or relief or triumph. Felt instead a very specific, very quiet kind of gratitude. Gratitude for the apartment, which had been mine before her and was still mine. For the east windows, for the 3 years I'd lived here quietly before I'd started organizing my happiness around someone else's. Gratitude, strangely, for Garrett's concert. Not without irony, but honest. If she'd come to Lisbon with me, the slow process of my own self-dissolution would have continued. She'd have been lovely on the trip, probably. Been present and warm, and made me feel chosen in the specific way she knew how. And I'd have come home refreshed and re-enrolled in the same terms. The concert was the clearest thing she ever did for me, without meaning to. I left the next morning, the airport at 6 a.m., has a specific quality of light. Fluorescent and equalizing, making everyone look like an earlier version of themselves. I moved through it with my carry-on and my passport and the boarding pass on my phone and the single rolling case I was taking as personal effects. Everything else having already shipped. Nobody was there to see me off. I'd said goodbye to Isolde the previous evening, briefly, in the hallway. She'd said something about giving it time, about being in touch. I'd said I'd be in touch about the legal process. She'd stood very still in the hallway, in a way that suggested she was hoping for a different ending to the scene. I said, "Take care of yourself, Isolde." I meant it. With the distance already in me, with the choice already made, I looked at her and felt something that wasn't anger, wasn't love anymore, but wasn't nothing either. It was the feeling of a fair witness, a person you've known well, seen fully, and released without cruelty. I took the door handle. The click of it was the same as it had been 11 days earlier from the other side. On the plane, I slept again. There's a thing that happens when you've made a real decision. Your body knows it before you do sometimes, and it just stops running maintenance. I slept the way I'd slept on the first flight, clean and complete, and woke up over France with the sky going light. Lisbon at 8 in the morning smells like bread and diesel and something floral that I'd come to think of as just the air there, the particular combination of the Atlantic and the old stone and the terraced hills. The corporate flat in Principe Real was on the 3rd floor of a building with a small elevator that hummed when it ran, a kitchen that faced an interior courtyard, and a bedroom that was quiet in the specific way only old buildings in cities can be quiet. Not silence, but the muting of the world's noise by stone. I put down my bag. I stood in the kitchen. I made coffee. Waited long enough this time. Thornfield Lisbon's office was a 10-minute walk through streets that in the early morning were still being swept and washed, the tiles catching the new light. My Portuguese was functional, but not fluent. I'd been studying for 6 months before the wedding, and then let it lapse, and now I picked it up again with a focus that felt like something unlocked, like a door I'd been standing in front of without trying the handle. The work was good. That part I want to say clearly, because this isn't a story only about what I left. It's a story about what I walked toward. The Lisbon office of Thornfield operated in a space I hadn't had access to in London. Heritage restoration, adaptive reuse, the kind of projects where you're working with buildings that have outlasted every human context they were built for and finding what they want to become next. My first assignment was a 19th century textile factory being converted into mixed residential and cultural space. The building had 3 interior courtyards, a structural iron framework that was remarkable by any standard, and a series of original tile panels on the factory floor that the preservation committee needed to either save in situ or relocate. I spent the first 2 weeks completely absorbed. When this is what I want to say about occupation as distinct from distraction. Distraction is a way of not being somewhere. Occupation is being fully in the place you've chosen. I wasn't avoiding thinking about Isolde or the apartment, or the divorce, or what I'd left. I was simply, for the first time in 3 years, pointing all of my attention at something that mattered to me without the background calculation of how it fit into someone else's preferences. The factory project required me to work closely with a structural engineer from the Portuguese practice, a precise and good-humored man who spoke perfect English with an accent I found pleasant, and an architectural historian named, and I'll use only her professional title here, Dr. Fonseca. Well, who knew more about 19th century Lisbon construction practices than anyone I'd encountered, and who had an academic's habit of answering every question with a better question. The work was real. The days were full. Isolde texted occasionally. The messages were measured. Nothing aggressive, nothing collapsing. She was processing in her own way, which was the only way she ever processed anything. Carefully, privately, at her own pace. I responded when there was something practical to respond to. She told me, 3 weeks into my time in Lisbon, that she'd found a flat in Clapham. A rental. She was moving in the following week. I said, "Good. Let me know if you need anything from Wyndham about the handover." She said, "Callum, do you think about whether this was the right choice?" I wrote back, "All the time." And it still is. She didn't respond after that, not that day. The Bermondsey apartment, when it went on the market, had 3 viewings in the first week and an offer within 12 days. Wyndham handled the tenants. A couple, both professionals, the kind of reference file that makes a landlord exhale. They moved in 60 days after my departure. The monthly sum began clearing into my account the following month, the first of what Tobias called, approvingly, a passive foundation. The Manchester property was already generating. The SIPP was compounding in the background like a quiet engine, the kind of wealth building that does its work without requiring your attention, only your earlier discipline. I was, for the first time in 3 years, financially clear. Not wealthy in any exceptional sense, but clear. Each asset in my name, and each income stream identified and flowing. No exposure I hadn't chosen. Elena told me, at the 12-week mark, that things were proceeding cleanly. Isolde had engaged a solicitor. Aldercroft had referred her to someone in family law, which was professionally sensible. Her solicitor had made initial inquiries about the apartment and the financial assets. The apartment inquiry was resolved quickly. Premarital, solely titled. No contributions from Isolde beyond her presence as a resident. Clean. The financial inquiry took slightly longer. Isolde's solicitor asked about the joint account withdrawal. Elena presented the documentation. Equal split, time-stamped, half the balance left intact, standard, nothing to contest. The asset portfolio drew a longer look, while Isolde's solicitor argued that 3 years of cohabitation preceding the marriage created a legitimate expectation of benefit. Elena's response was measured but definitive. 3 years of cohabitation in England and Wales does not, in itself, create rights to the other party's assets. The marriage was 3 weeks old. The assets were pre-established and non-marital in their origin. Short marriage, no children, no shared financial commitments beyond the joint account. The case for a financial remedy order was weak. Isolde's solicitor did not press it. I won't pretend I didn't expect some version of this fight, but I'd done the work to make it a short one. Not through hardness, through documentation and structure. Every choice I'd made in the years before the marriage, and the choices I'd made in the weeks after it ended, Chaucer had been made cleanly enough that there was nothing to dispute. The record was what it was. At the 20-week mark, I applied for the conditional order. At the 30-week mark, it was granted. I was in a restaurant in Alfama when Elena's message came through, a place I'd found in the 2nd month and returned to regularly because the Bacalhau was exceptional and the room was lit by candles and the walls were thick enough to keep the street out. I read the message, put my phone down, and finished my meal. That was all. Just finished the meal, ordered the wine I'd been considering, and drank it while the candles went low and the room filled and emptied around me. There's a thing that happens when the legal process catches up with the emotional one. It has none of the catharsis that drama would assign it. It's just confirmation, and the external world aligning with the internal map you've been working from for months. I'd already been living in this new version of my life for 7 months. The court order wasn't the moment I was free. That had been a Tuesday morning on a waterfront in Lisbon, eating a custard tart. The court order was just the paperwork saying the map was accurate. Garrett, in the months that followed, released a single. It did reasonably well. Better than his recent work, which had been struggling to find the audience that had loved the first thing. He toured again. Isolde, I knew from the occasional mutual friend who still made contact, went to shows. She was processing her version of this story, which was her right. I wasn't interested in her version, not out of bitterness, out of the clean and complete way you're uninterested in the weather of a city you no longer live in. I had a city of my own. The corporate flat in Príncipe Real was fine for the first 6 months. It had the qualities of a good transitional space, functional, neutral, requiring nothing from me emotionally. By month 7, I started looking at properties. Not urgently, not dramatically. Just looking, the way you look at a city you intend to inhabit seriously. I found a place in Santos, which is a neighborhood along the river that has the quality of being in a city, but watching it rather than being consumed by it. Ground floor of an old building, private entrance, a small walled garden in the back where a fig tree had been growing undisturbed for what looked like decades. The kitchen needed work. The floors were original and needed nothing. Thus, I bought it on a Friday afternoon and walked back along the river to my rental flat, in the kind of weather that makes Lisbon feel like it's been assembled specifically for the afternoon. The light low and warm on the old walls. The river doing what the river does, which is simply to go on being the river. I didn't call anyone that evening. I didn't need to. There wasn't a performance to put on. I stopped in at the Pastelaria on the corner by my building, the one where I'd been going often enough that the woman behind the counter knew my order, and she put the coffee and the tart on the counter before I'd said a word. I said, "Obrigado." She said, "De nada." I sat at the counter for a while, and drank the coffee, and looked at the street, and thought about the cab ride to the airport from Bermondsey, 11 months ago now. The city dark and waking up, Isolde sitting at the table with her tea. The distance wasn't satisfying. I want to be honest about that. There was no cold triumph in it, no score being settled. The distance was simply accurate, the measurement of how far I'd needed to go to find the life that had been mine all along. Tobias came to visit in October, which in Lisbon is the beginning of the best weather. I showed him the Santos property, which I'd been having renovated slowly and without urgency, the kitchen replaced, the garden cleared, the one window in the main room that had been painted shut, freed, and working. We sat in the garden under the fig tree with wine, and he looked at me for a while and then said, "You seem different." I said, "Different how?" He said, "Less managed." I thought about that. "Yeah," I said. That's about right." He said, "How's the work?" I said, "The textile factory is going to be extraordinary. The tile panels survived. All of them. We're keeping them in situ." He said, "And personally?" I said, "Good." He said, "Anyone?" I said, "Not yet. Maybe." And I thought of Dr. Fonseca, who had asked me a question 2 weeks ago about where I grew up, and the way the question had arrived in the middle of a technical discussion like a door that had been opened without ceremony, and how I'd answered it and asked her the same thing, and how the conversation had moved from the factory floor to a long walk along the waterfront and dinner at a place she knew that wasn't in any listing. But that's a different story, and it was early enough that I wasn't ready to tell it yet. I said, "I'll tell you when there's something to tell." He said, "Fair enough." We sat in the garden until the evening came down. The fig tree made a shadow across the stones that moved with the slight wind. The river was 2 streets away, and you could feel it rather than see it, the weight of moving water in the air. Elena's final message about the proceedings had come through the week before. The final order had been granted. The dissolution was complete. There was a specific word in the legal language, absolute, the absolute order. I'd read it and noted it and filed it in a folder on my laptop and gone back to the factory plans. That's all. Tobias poured more wine and said, "To Lisbon." I raised my glass. To Lisbon. To the boarding pass I'd kept. To the suitcase that had been packed for 11 days. To the cab I'd taken alone. To the door that clicks shut at the right moment. Some endings don't feel like endings. They feel like rooms opening. Like the window in the Santos house that had been painted shut for years, and then one day, with the right tool applied in the right direction, came free. I didn't look back through it. I just let the air in. She called once, 7 months after the final order. Not to argue, not to negotiate. She said she was getting married again. Not to Garrett, somebody else, someone she'd met at work. She said she wanted me to know before I heard it from someone else. I said, "Congratulations, Isolde. I hope he makes you happy." She said, "I hope you're happy too." I said, "I'm getting there." I was already there. I was standing in the garden in Santos when she called, the September sun cutting through the fig tree in the way it did in that hour, the stone warm under my feet. The kitchen renovation was done. The floors were right. I'd framed one of the old tile samples from the factory project and hung it in the main room because Dr. Fonseca had told me it was from a section of the floor that corresponded to the building's original weaving hall, and I liked knowing the history of it. I said goodbye to Isolde. I put the phone in my pocket. I walked inside.